Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of Faith No More, one of the most unique bands to come out of the 80s in my opinion, and a group that were pioneers of the alternative metal genre and created some truly unique sounding music that fused together so many different styles and would influence bands for decades to come. Their 7-album discography is quite the adventure to go through, and it offers so many different flavors for different music listeners, and I've always loved the diversity of thought within the Faith No More community. When you look at how people rank their albums, everybody's list is usually completely different, and each album can be loved and praised for many different reasons, and I've seen people make convincing arguments for almost all of their albums and why they could be considered one of their best works. So I'm very excited to be covering them for today's episode. So what I'm going to do is go through their 7 studio albums, starting with We Care a Lot and going up to Soul Invictus, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree with my takes and how you would rank these 7 albums, so please let me know. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Alright, we will start out with their debut studio album from 1985 titled We Care a Lot, and I'm going to give this one a C, unfortunately. Not the strongest debut album in my opinion. This album and their second release are the only 2 studio albums to feature the original vocalist Chuck Mosley, who would be replaced by Mike Patton on their 3rd album. And stylistically, this definitely has some similarities to the Mike Patton stuff, with the alternative metal and funk metal elements and the mixing of the guitars and keyboards, which is something that I think is a staple of the Faith No More sound and something that you hear right from the first album. I wouldn't say that the music gets as adventurous and doesn't veer off into as many different territories as the Mike Patton stuff does, but I still think that the core elements of their sound were there from this first album. I don't resonate as much with this album, and I think the quality of songs on here is not the greatest. For me, I think the opening 2 tracks, the title track We Care a Lot and track 2 The Jungle, I think those are fairly strong and are the highlight of the album. But then from that point on, the momentum really dies down for me, and the majority of the rest of the album I'm just not crazy about. I do really enjoy the instrumental guitar track titled Jim. I think it's a great transitional track and showcases Jim's impressive guitar work more on the classical side of things, and I honestly wouldn't have minded if they had other guitar-centered tracks like this on the next 3 releases that Jim would play on, but this is really the only time that they include a track like this throughout the Faith No More discography. On the flip side though, I also do think that stylistically this track is a little bit out of place and random in comparison to everything else on this album, and probably could have been incorporated in a more effective manner. But other than that, the only other track on here that I don't mind is As the Worm Turns. I think the guitar and keyboard parts are pretty cool on that one, but also I wouldn't say it's an exceptional Faith No More track either. And throughout this album, there might be a cool guitar groove here and there, but as far as full songs go, I do find the majority of this album pretty boring and uninteresting, with the exception of the opening 2 tracks and Jim. And none of the songs on here would be regarded as any of my favorite Faith No More tracks, but there still are some fun moments, and like I said, it does still contain some of those core elements of the Faith No More sound, which will continue to get expanded upon in future releases. So not the greatest album to start out with, unfortunately, so this one gets a C. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1987 titled Introduce Yourself, the final album to feature Chuck Mosley on vocals, and I'm going to surprise some people and give this one an A. I know a lot of people don't resonate as much with the Chuck Mosley albums, but I really enjoy this one, and I do consider it to be a big upgrade from the first release on a variety of different levels. In my opinion, the production is much stronger, it has more standout tracks, and the general vibe of this album is much more cohesive from front to back. It contains that great fusion of alternative metal, rap metal, and funk, and I think this was a very good predecessor to the Mike Patton era of Faith No More and set up a really great foundation for them to continue to build off of. This album is filled with all sorts of tasty, heavy, and badass guitar riffs on songs like Introduce Yourself, Death March, R&R, and Spirit. The keyboard and guitar writing is very unique, particularly on songs like Chinese Arithmetic, The Crab Song, and Blood. And Chuck's slightly out-of-tune vocals, I think, add a really cool additional layer of eeriness to the songs in a way that I think is actually very fitting. I know not everybody likes that, but I think it's pretty cool on this album. I love the background vocals too, particularly on the more yelling parts of songs like Introduce Yourself, Chinese Arithmetic, and Death March. And I like the re-recorded version of We Care a Lot. I like this version more than the one from the first release, and I think it really highlights the upgrade in the production on this album when you hear the two tracks back to back. I find this album to be much better than the first release on just about every front. The only thing that I like more about We Care a Lot is the opening track. I still really enjoy faster disco on here, but I do think that We Care a Lot has a more gripping and intriguing opening song in comparison to this one. But other than that, I think everything else about this album is far superior to We Care a Lot. My favorite song on here is probably Blood, just such an incredible and badass track. And my other two favorites are Anne's Song and Death March. And after the release of this album, they were touring in 1988, and they had started experiencing a lot of issues with Chuck on a variety of different levels with some violent outbursts. And this caused the band to reassess what they wanted to do moving forward. And the consensus was that Chuck needed to go, so they had fired him, and this would be his last album with the group. And I think this was a great album for him to go out on, and certainly an improvement from the first release. And I think now the band was in a position where their writing had evolved and continued to improve and became more refined. And now they're in a great spot to continue to build off of the momentum that they had established and deliver us some amazing albums with their soon-to-be vocalist, Mike Patton. So a very good second album and a great album for Chuck to go out on. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have their third studio album and first release to feature Mike Patton on vocals from 1989, titled The Real Thing. And I'm going to give this one an A. A very good album, not their best release in my opinion, but certainly a very good first Mike Patton release to put out there. I know some people consider this to be one of their best albums, and this has always been an interesting one for me because I initially loved it when I first heard it. And if I was making this video shortly after hearing this album for the first time, I would have put it in S tier, but after listening to it more and more, I actually started to like it a little bit less, especially in comparison to a couple of the later albums, but it's still a great album regardless. Obviously not a bad album by any stretch. All of the music on here had been written prior to getting Mike Patton on vocals, and he only contributed lyrics, and I think that was one thing that was lacking from this record. I don't find that a lot of the songs on here have that unique Mike Patton flavor to the songwriting, and instead to me it almost sounds like a continuation of the first two albums with a new vocalist and with a couple of new stylistic territories thrown in here and there on tracks like Zombie Eaters and the title track The Real Thing, which goes in all sorts of interesting territories. And just to clarify, even though I'm saying it's a continuation of the first two albums, I still think this album is way better than We Care a Lot. We still have the heavy badass guitar riffs, the funky bass lines, the great guitar and keyboard writing, and great vocal work that introduces Mike Patton really nicely and sets a great framework for future Faith No More albums to continue to flourish. I do think that Mike Patton's vocals evolve more and get into even more awesome territories from the next album and onward. But vocally, even on this album, I think Mike Patton's work is still a big step up from Chuck Mosley's vocals. I would say the majority of this album has more of that groovy, funk metal, feel-good sort of vibe for a lot of it, and you really hear that in the opening three tracks, from Out of Nowhere, Epic, and Falling to Pieces. And some songs will have really heavy and darker moments, but really the only full-blown dark and heavy track on here is Surprise, You're Dead, with those heavy guitar and drum grooves and the intense screaming from Mike Patton, which I always love to hear. And I wish they had done a few more songs like that on this release because I really love the dark side of Faith No More. But this album definitely falls more into that feel-good sort of vibe. So that would probably be another reason for me putting it into A tier instead of S, just more of a stylistic preference on my part. But regardless of that, this is still a great album with a really nice flow and consistency to it, and definitely has a nice chunk of really amazing songs, and to me doesn't have any songs that I dislike or any skip over tracks. If I had to narrow it down, my two favorites on here are Falling to Pieces and Epic. So a very good album, not my number one favorite of theirs, but still a great first Mike Patton release. So this one will get an A. Alright, now we have their fourth studio album from 1992 titled Angel Dust, and unsurprisingly, this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, and this is the one that most people typically list as their favorite Faith No More album, and I'm going to be cliche and agree with that. This is also my favorite album of theirs. Musically, I think this one reaches new levels and has the most interesting mixture of compositions, and if I was to make a list of my top 10 favorite Faith No More tracks, this would be the album with the most songs on that list by far, and this is their first release where Mike Patton had any influence on the songwriting, and I think that also made a huge difference. Stylistically, they branch out more on this album than anything prior to it, and I think they do it in the most interesting and tasteful way possible, while still maintaining that metal foundation and never losing the core of the Faith No More sound, but rather just expanding upon it and introducing lots of new stylistic flavors, which make for a very enjoyable and adventurous listen. Unfortunately, this is the last album to feature Jim Martin on guitar, as there had been a lot of clashes and tension throughout the recording process of this album, which would ultimately lead to Jim leaving the band for good. I think Mike's vocal work is much more dynamic and refined on this one as opposed to the previous release. I love the versatility of his voice. He's really doing it all on here with the melodic singing, the low, deep singing, whispering, yelling, and the metal screaming, and we hear those singing styles mixed all throughout this album in the most fitting way possible. Throughout this record, we have the perfect blend of everything that I want to hear from Faith No More stylistically. It opens up on more of an epic, theatrical sort of mood with Land of Sunshine, and then from there takes us through such a fun journey. We have incredible alternative metal tracks like Caffeine, Midlife Crisis, Smaller and Smaller, then a few heavier tracks that venture more into that thrash metal territory with Malpractice and Jizzlobber. Then we have a couple of tracks that incorporate that funk metal sort of hybrid with Be Aggressive and Crack Hitler. And then a few songs that I think are sort of in a category of their own, like track 4 titled RV. And I think this is the first song where we hear a very clear precursor to the Mr. Bungle sound. It's got Mike Patton all over this track, which I love so much, and I think it provides such a nice and interesting little detour in the beginning part of the album. I also really love track 10, A Small Victory. I think it's a great vibe. At that point in the album, we've been hit with so much hard-hitting, dark, and heavy stuff, and that song provides a nice little change of pace with a more feel-good and groovy number, and I think that sets up the final 3 tracks of the album perfectly. And then concluding the album with a cover of the Midnight Cowboy theme was a very cool choice, a really interesting instrumental that builds very well and wraps up the album very nicely and also very unexpectedly too. For me personally, my favorite part of this album is the vocal melodies of Mike Patton. One thing that he does that I've always found particularly intriguing is write these vocal melodies that oftentimes end on these eerie and dissonant notes that you really don't expect. And those are some of my favorite moments in all of Faith No More and Mr. Bungle's music. And we hear that on a few tracks throughout this album. A couple of my favorites that do this are Everything's Ruined and Kindergarten, which are also my 2 favorite tracks on here by far. Kindergarten is my number 1 and a track that I think is one of the unsung heroes to this album. It's got everything that I want to hear. It's heavy, it's groovy, it's got great vocal parts, great guitar and keyboard writing, just everything that I love in a Faith No More song. And then Everything's Ruined as well contains all of those great elements. You know, it's really hard to narrow it down to a couple of favorites because every single track on here is incredible, but those 2 in particular have always really stood out to me. So I really think this is a perfect album. It's got great replay value. It's got some of the most badass Faith No More songs, but also some of the most interesting ones too, and just makes for an incredibly intriguing and enjoyable listen. I'm sad that this would be the last album to feature Jim Martin because he was my favorite guitarist from Faith No More, but I don't think he could have went out on a better album, and I think they truly found their collective sound on here, and now they're just ready to continue off of that on their future albums. So incredible album. My number 1 album of Faith No More. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 5th studio album from 1995 titled King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime. And for me, this is another one that gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album and the perfect follow-up to complement Angel Dust. To me, this album contains those core sounds that we had heard in Angel Dust and mixes things up really nicely and does a great job of keeping things interesting from track to track. We have 14 songs on here, and I pretty much love every song, with the exception of one track, which we will get to. I think when you compare Angel Dust and The Real Thing, I think Angel Dust is a little more on the darker side, whereas The Real Thing is more feel-good good and groovy, and I think this album contains the best of both worlds and does a really great job of giving us a lot of tracks that sound like a follow-up to Angel Dust, but also mixing it up and incorporating a little bit more groovy and feel-good songs as well, which I think provides a really nice balance. We have a handful of experimental rock and metal tracks on here like Get Out, Ricochet, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, Digging the Grave, King for a Day, What a Day, and The Last to Know. In the first chunk of the album, we balance out those tracks nicely with the two funkier numbers with Evidence and Star AD, both incredible songs. And then we also have some of those really heavy and thrashy sounding songs with Cuckoo for Kaka, Ugly in the Morning, and What a Day. And then we have a couple of more spacey and chiller tracks as well that complement everything else really nicely with songs like Caralho Vord, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, as well as Take This Bottle and Just a Man. I will say that Take This Bottle is the one song on here that I can do without. That song has really never done anything for me for some reason, but other than that, I think the remaining 13 tracks are all incredible. And then the closing track, Just a Man, is stylistically almost in a category of its own and provides a really tasteful change in pace to conclude the album on. And I think the stylistic variety throughout this album is done in an incredibly effective way. I think all of the tracks are placed perfectly, and the album has such a great momentum to it and takes us through such an enjoyable and adventurous journey from one track to the next. My favorite song on here is probably Star AD. I think that song just grooves so hard, and again, I love Mike Patton's vocal melodies on that one, as well as the horn parts, which add a really nice additional layer to the track. A couple of other favorites for me are Ugly in the Morning, The Last to Know, Evidence, and Ricochet. Really hard to narrow it down because there are so many bangers on here. But yeah, like I said, an amazing album and a perfect follow-up to the very hard-to-follow Angel Dust. This is another one that gets an easy S. Okay, continuing on, we have their sixth studio album from 1997 titled Album of the Year. And unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a B. Not a bad album, but in my opinion, not one of their strongest releases, and I do think that they did lose a little bit of momentum that they had developed from their previous three albums, which is unfortunate because this will be the last album that they put out before their hiatus and almost 20-year gap before putting out another release. I know some people will disagree with this take, and it seems like this is probably one of the Faith No More albums that people are the most divided on. Some people rank this one very high, and others have it lower on their list. And I've always felt like this one does fall a little flat, especially in comparison to the previous three releases. But with that being said, there are still some amazing songs on here, without question. I just think that as an album, it doesn't have as good of a momentum as the previous releases. And for me, it definitely has a couple of skip-over tracks, which are ultimately my main two reasons for putting it in B tier. It still contains that alternative metal core while veering into other stylistic territories. I think the album opens up very strongly. The opening two tracks are great, Collision and Strip Search. Collision brings the album in the most hard-hitting and badass way possible. And then Strip Search brings things down a bit in this really mysterious sort of vibe and provides a great contrast from the opening track. I particularly love the keyboard lines in this song as well. After the opening two songs, this is where the album does start to lose a little bit of steam for me. I've never been crazy about the two songs that follow it, Last Cup of Sorrow and Naked in Front of the Computer. Neither of those songs have ever really done much for me, and I don't find anything about them particularly exciting or unique. I know Last Cup of Sorrow was a single, and a lot of people loved that track, but for some reason, no matter how many times I listened to it, it just never clicked and grew on me. Not sure why. I do absolutely love track 5, though, titled Helpless, particularly the chorus. I think that has one of the most hard-hitting and satisfying choruses of this album, with the distortion over Mike's vocals and the switch from acoustic guitars into the distorted electric guitars. Then we continue with two more songs that I wouldn't say I dislike, but I also don't think they're really exceptional or standout Faith No More tracks either, with Mouth to Mouth and Ashes to Ashes. So as you can see, for me personally, there have already been a few dips within the first 7 tracks of this album. The ending chunk does have a few more songs that I'm not crazy about as well, but it does redeem itself with a couple of songs that I really enjoy, with She Loves Me Not, Homesick Home, and the closing track, Pristina. I've never been super crazy about Got That Feeling and Paths of Glory, unfortunately, But yeah, as you can see, there are still a good handful of tracks that I do really enjoy. But for me, I have always struggled with the pacing of this album. There's a few too many dips in momentum for me to really consider it a great Faith No More album, even in spite of the awesome songs that are on here. And maybe I'm just missing something with this release and I need to listen to it more because, like I said, there are a lot of people that do put this one in very high regard. And I have seen this one make a lot of people's top 3 favorite Faith No More album lists. So maybe I do need to listen to it more. But I have listened to it a lot of times already. And based on the amount of times that I have heard it, this is where I stand on it currently. So not an amazing album, but not terrible either. Somewhere in between for me. So this one will get a B. All right, and now we have their 7th and most recent studio album from 2015 titled Soul Invictus, a comeback record with almost a 20-year gap from the previous release. And unfortunately, I'm also going to give this one a B. I've always thought that this album was okay, but definitely nothing exceptional or standout in the grand scheme of their discography. It still definitely sounds like Faith No More from a stylistic perspective and still contains the wide, adventurous musical shifts from track to track that are cloaked in this alt-metal sort of framework. And while it does have a chunk of songs on here that I do appreciate, it also contains a handful of tracks that I do find pretty underwhelming and boring. And I have heard some people say that they initially didn't like this album, but the more they listened to it, the more it grew on them. And I really tried with this one and listened to it a good amount of times, but nothing really seemed to change from one listen to the next. And the songs that I'm not crazy about on here pretty much remain that way no matter how many times I listen to the album. Nothing really grew on me over time. I think the opening 4 tracks are definitely really strong. Soul Invictus is a solid opener that does a great job of establishing a more subdued and mellow vibe that made me curious as to what sort of direction they were going to take on this album, because it very much feels like an introduction track that builds very nicely over its 2.5 minutes. And then Superhero is a great follow-up track and would definitely be my favorite song on here. This song contains everything I love about Faith No More: badass hard-hitting guitar riffs, funky bass lines, eerie vocals, and intense screams from Mike Patton. The perfect banger of a song to get the album going. And then Sunny Side Up does a great job of giving us a little stylistic detour from track 2. And then Separation Anxiety brings back more of that darker and heavier side for track 4. I do consider these 4 tracks to be the high point of the album, and if I was comparing it to the previous release, Album of the Year, I would say that the opening of this is stronger. And from this point on, we will still have a couple of songs that I like Rise of the Fall and Matador, but at the same time, these are not tracks that I would consider really standout or exceptional tracks in the grand scheme of the Faith No More discography. And once again, like the previous release, this one also does still have a couple of skip-over tracks for me, like Cone of Shame, Black Friday, and The Closer, From the Dead. So while it does have a handful of songs that I like and a really solid opening 4 tracks, I still don't find that this album has any songs that would make my list of favorite Faith No More songs, and I do think it has a few skip-over tracks, and for a comeback album with almost a 20-year gap from the previous release, I think I went in with a little too high of expectations, and unfortunately this one didn't match up to what I was expecting, but like I said, it still has a couple of really solid tracks, and I'm still grateful that they delivered us a 7th album after such a long time off. So not the greatest return album in my opinion, and like I said, maybe I need to listen to it more and see if it grows on me, but I have listened to it a good handful of times and nothing has really changed. So for where I stand right now with this album, I'm going to give this one a B. Alright, so there it is. Those are my personal rankings of their 7 studio albums. Usually when I make these videos, there always tends to be a couple of albums that I need to re-listen to really solidify my thoughts on them. But this one was pretty easy for me, and I feel like my thoughts on these albums have been pretty much the same since I first heard them, other than The Real Thing getting a little downgrade over time, and Introduce Yourself getting better with age as well. Those are probably the only 2 exceptions where my thoughts did change a little bit over time. But yeah, this is what I came up with. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear how you rank these albums and where you agree and disagree with my assessments, what you think I might be missing out on. And yeah, that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope it was enjoyable for you. And if you are interested, feel free to check out my other tier lists and see if there's anything else you might like. They will be linked in the comments and the description. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.